ladies and gentlemen, here's our last video for Chapter 4. It's the vocabulary review. I'm just using the last 2 pages in your note-taking guide with vocabulary. There will be a couple of things I mentioned at the end of the video that you'll want to make sure you study. But remember, going back and reviewing your videos, reviewing your notes is a good way to prepare. The first 2 words they have for us is triangle and vertex. A triangle is just a geometric figure with 3 sides, and then the vertex is where the sides intersect. That's where we find the angles of the triangle. So there's 3 angles and 3 sides. The vertex is those corners where the sides intersect. An equilateral triangle is a triangle with 3 congruent, meaning equal sides. And so you're going to recognize that it's congruent with those congruency marks. So we can see that in that diagram. We then have isosceles triangle and scalene triangle. Isosceles is a triangle with 2 congruent sides, so we see 2 sides marked as being congruent. And then the scalene triangle is a triangle with no congruent sides. So I didn't draw a diagram because there's nothing that's marked on there. They're either going to mark the sides as congruent, or they will label them with measurements that you need to recognize as being the same, being equal. But for scalene, none of the sides will be the same measurement. Nothing will be marked with congruency. Equilateral triangle is a triangle with 3 congruent angles. Equiangular triangle is a triangle with 3 congruent angles. So we should see equal angles in there. What you need to remember from that is that all 3 angles will measure 60 degrees. And that was something that was kind of inferred, is what I would say in there. They weren't explicit with it in saying all 3 angles equal 60 degrees. But if we take 180 and divide it by 3, we get 60 degrees. An acute triangle is a triangle with 3 angles that all measure less than 90 degrees. So we're pulling on those definitions from earlier in the year. A right triangle is a triangle with 1 right angle, so it's 90 degrees. And then an obtuse triangle is a triangle with 1 obtuse angle, which means 1 angle that measures more than 90 degrees. We then talked about interior angles and exterior angle. What we need to remember is that the interior angles have a sum of 180. So if everything's together on the inside, I'm going to put everything together and set it equal to 180. The exterior angle is that angle outside, where we extend one side of our triangle and we have this angle outside. And what we need to remember is that the exterior angle is equal to the sum of the 2 interior angles. So the way I started talking to some people about it during their quiz fix, we have our 2 interior angles. We then are going to put our equal sign when we jump outside of our triangle to our exterior angle. We then are going to talk about the legs, the base, and the base angles of an isosceles triangle. So the legs are the 2 congruent sides. So legs are the congruent sides. Base angles are the angles opposite those sides. The base is just that 3rd side, the non-congruent side. And then what we need to remember, what we learned from there, is not only are the legs the congruent sides, but the base angles are those 2 congruent angles. And so this was the lesson where we said, okay, if I know I have 2 congruent sides, then I can find my missing angles by setting base angles equal to each other. I then said if I had 2 base angles that were congruent, if I had 2 congruent angles inside the triangle, then I knew the sides opposite those were equal to each other. So I then could start finding measurements of legs. So these went together as a converse of each other in our formula, but we can go from knowing equal angles to finding equal sides. We can go from having equal sides to finding equal angles. Legs and hypotenuse of a right triangle. The legs are the 2 sides that make the right angle, and then the hypotenuse is C, and that's our longest side. I guess that would be one thing I would add in there, is that the hypotenuse is the longest side. That's something that I think we need to remember in there and be able to recall. So your hypotenuse is across from the 90-degree angle. It's the longest side, and you label that with C. In this lesson, we used that Pythagorean theorem, which was C squared is equal to A squared plus B squared. Also realize that the Pythagorean theorem is what we are going to use to classify our angles. So you need to look at lesson 4.5 and look at when C squared is greater than A squared plus B squared, what that tells us about the triangle, and what C squared is less than A squared plus B squared. The median of a triangle is the segment that connects a vertex of a triangle to the midpoint of the opposite side. I pulled back on that definition of median from statistics, that the median is the middle number. So the median is connecting to the middle of the opposite side. And then once we learned what medians were, we could introduce this idea of a centroid. And the centroid is that point of intersection of all three medians of a triangle. That centroid then creates special relationships on that median where we have 1/3 of the measurement and then 2/3 above the centroid. So vertex to centroid is 2/3 of the segment. Centroid to side is 1/3 of the segment. All right. You probably had to pause things as you were going through to catch up, and that's okay, but we will check these tomorrow.